They called her too weak to continue, until she took down an entire training squad. The bag hit the floor before she did. Nora dropped it at the entrance of the training facility, straightened her spine, and looked around at a room that was already looking back at her. 22 men, various sizes, various expressions, all of them arriving at the same conclusion at roughly the same speed, which was fast, and which they did not bother to hide. She picked up the bag. She found her bunk. She made it tight, the way the intake sheet said to, and she sat on the edge of it and looked at her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Then she stood up and walked to the orientation hall with everyone else. The facility was a converted military complex, about 40 miles outside the city. The walls were painted a shade of gray that seemed designed to remind you of nothing pleasant. The floors were rubber matting over concrete. Every hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and the kind of effort that has stopped being voluntary. Nora had read about the place before she applied. She had read about it again after she was accepted. She knew its dimensions, its daily schedule, its washout rate, and she knew those numbers, and she had applied anyway. There were 8 weeks ahead of her. 8 weeks to prove she belonged in a federal field training program that had, in its 12-year history, graduated 61 recruits. 59 of them were men. The 2 women who had passed before her had done it in different cohorts, years apart, and neither of them had talked about it publicly in any detail. Nora understood why. She was not the tallest in the room. She was not the heaviest. On paper, in the column that tracked physical benchmarks, she sat below the median on 4 of the 7 categories. She knew that too. The lead instructor was a man named Colin Briggs. He was built like someone had designed him to take up exactly the right amount of space, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life been told to reconsider. He read the cohort's names from a clipboard during the first briefing, and when he got to hers he paused. Not long, a half second. The kind of pause that is not a pause to the person making it, and is everything to the person hearing it. He called her Scrappy on day 3. She was running the balance and coordination circuit, a series of suspended platforms over a shallow pit, requiring precision over power. She cleared it in the 3rd fastest time of the morning. Briggs watched her step off the final platform and said, to no one in particular, that she was scrappy. The word landed the way a certain kind of compliment always lands on a woman who has spent her life being underestimated. It was wrapped in something that looked like approval and felt like a ceiling. She filed it. She did not respond to it. She walked to the water station and drank and waited for the next drill. The other recruits were not, in the way Nora had perhaps steeled herself against, openly dismissive. They were polite. They passed her the equipment she needed. A recruit named Gary Ashton, broad-shouldered and from somewhere in Ohio, held the door for her twice on the first day and looked genuinely surprised both times when she said thank you, as though he had expected her not to notice. A recruit named Pete Calloway, who had a prior background in collegiate wrestling and made sure most people knew it, nodded at her during the first team drill and then looked away quickly, the way people look away from things they have not yet decided how to categorize. They were not cruel, they were simply certain. They had already constructed a version of the next 8 weeks in their heads, and in that version she was not present at the finish line. They were so certain that they did not even feel the need to say it. The certainty sat in the air of the room the way cold does, invisible, everywhere, and something you just adjusted to. Nora had adjusted to it her entire life. She had grown up the second of 3 children in a household in western Pennsylvania, where her father had run a small mechanical workshop, and her mother had managed the books for 3 different small businesses simultaneously. Neither of her parents had been particularly interested in the idea that certain things were not for certain people. Her father had taught her to change a tire at 9. Her mother had taught her to read a profit and loss statement at 11. By the time she was 14, she had rebuilt a small engine from parts and was running 3 miles before school on alternate mornings, because She liked the feeling of having done something difficult before the day had technically started. She was not, in other words, unfamiliar with rooms that had not expected her. The first week passed the way first weeks in hard programs always pass, too fast and too slow at the same time. The physical demands were front-loaded deliberately, designed to establish early who had the baseline and who did not. Nora's baseline was not the problem. She knew her numbers. She had been training for this specific program for 11 months, adjusting her workload every 6 weeks based on whatever gap she had identified in her previous cycle. The problem was not the numbers. The problem was that her numbers were not the ones people looked at first. They looked at her height, 164 centimeters. They looked at her weight, 61 kilograms. They ran those numbers against the physical benchmarks, and they drew a conclusion that the numbers did not actually support, but that felt, to anyone looking at the surface of things, intuitive. She let them look. On day 5, the cohort ran a timed 2-mile assessment in full kit. Nora finished 7th out of 23. She was not first. First was a recruit named Owen Drake, former collegiate sprinter, who finished a full 40 seconds ahead of the second-place recruit and appeared to be running at something close to a comfortable pace. But 7th was not what the room had predicted for her, and she felt that in the small shift of energy that occurred when she crossed the line and the recruits around her recalculated slightly. Not much, just slightly. On day 7, the weekly performance board went up. Her name sat at 14 out of 23, which was a combined ranking across all measured categories. Physical placed her at 17. Technical and cognitive placed her at 4. The composite did not flatter her because the weighting favored physical. She knew that going in. She stood in front of the board for 3 seconds. She read her placement twice. Then she walked to the cafeteria and ate her dinner and went over her notes for the next day's drills. 14, fine, there were 7 weeks left. She thought about her mother sometimes in those early evenings, when the lights in the bunk hall dimmed and the compound went quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation system cycling. Her mother was not a dramatic woman. She did not give speeches. What she did, when things were difficult, was make a very small and specific plan for the next morning and then go to sleep. Nora had picked that up without being taught it directly. She planned. She slept 4 hours. She planned again in the dark before the alarm. Gary Ashton asked her one evening, near the end of the first week, why she had applied for this program. They were both at the equipment cleaning station, and the question came out with a kind of genuine curiosity that Nora had not quite expected from him. She told him because she was good at it. He nodded, with the expression of someone processing a statement that is both simpler and more complicated than they expected, and then he asked what she meant by good at it. She told him she meant exactly what she said. He nodded again and went back to cleaning his gear, and she went back to cleaning hers, and nothing more was said. But something shifted, just slightly, in the way he looked at her after that. Not respect exactly. Something earlier than respect. Something closer to attention. By the end of that first week, the compound had already taken on its own particular texture. The specific sound of 23 people moving through the same difficult days. The way mornings smelled different from evenings. The pattern of who spoke during meals and who did not, and what that said about them. Nora had cataloged most of it by day 4. She cataloged things. It was not something she did consciously. It was simply the way her mind organized the world around her, into patterns, gaps, and the distance between what people said and what they actually meant. She had spotted the gaps in this program the way she always did. The physical ranking weighted her low. The cognitive and technical rankings did not. The exercise designers had built a program where physical performance was the most visible metric, which meant it was the one everyone tracked, which meant she would spend the next 7 weeks being underestimated in direct proportion to the gap between what was visible and what was real. She was not angry about that yet. She was still in the collecting phase. Every small dismissal, every half-second pause, every look that lasted a fraction too long or not long enough. She filed them one at a time, neatly, the way her mother filed receipts. She did not know yet exactly what she would do with them. She kept collecting. She sat on the edge of her bunk that last night of week 1 with her kit laid out for the next morning, and the performance board's numbers running quietly through her head, and she looked at her hands again the way she had on the first day. They were a little rougher than they had been 7 days ago. The palms had adjusted. The skin had decided to stop complaining and get on with it. She turned off her light. Tomorrow was week 2. She had 6 more of them. She was going to need every single one. The second week arrived with rain. Not the kind that apologizes, the kind that simply continues. Nora was up before the alarm, which was something Briggs noticed because Briggs noticed everything and cataloged it in his own way, though his cataloging and hers led to entirely different conclusions. She was already at the morning station with her kit squared when the first handful of recruits appeared, and Briggs watched her from the doorway of the equipment room for a moment before he moved on. He did not say anything. He rarely did at that stage. He was the kind of man who let his silences do the communicating and assumed other people were fluent in that language. Most of them were not. Nora was. She heard what he did not say every time he walked past her assessment scores, without commenting on the technical columns. She heard it in the way he addressed the physical drills as though they were the only drills that mattered, which was a choice, and choices said things. She had grown up listening to the language underneath the language people spoke, and she had become, over the years, very good at it. The second week was structured around team exercises. Small unit problem solving, 4 recruits per group, rotating leadership, time-limited objectives. The purpose was partly to test individual performance under pressure and partly to assess how people functioned when the goal required cooperation rather than individual output. It was, in Nora's assessment of the program, the most interesting week on the schedule. She was grouped initially with Pete Calloway, a recruit named Dean Hartley who had come out of a background in civil engineering, and a recruit named Simon Cross who was quiet and methodical, and had, in the first week, posted the highest composite technical score in the cohort. Nora had noted that. She had also noted that Simon Cross had not been given much attention by the instructors despite his score, because his physical ranking was on the lower end, and that was what the room was tracking. The 4 of them were handed their first team objective at 6:30 on Monday of week 2. It involved navigating a flooded obstacle course, retrieving a set of specific items from marked stations, and returning within a fixed time limit. The rain had made the course unpredictable. Puddles had become miniature lakes. The footing had changed overnight. The whole thing required a reread of the terrain before committing to any route. Pete Calloway, who was the designated leader for the first rotation, studied the course map for about 90 seconds and then announced his plan. It was a direct route plan, fastest visible line between points, adjusted for the size of the obstacles. It was the plan that looked correct from the map. Nora looked at the course itself rather than the map and said, quietly, that the second station was flooded to a depth that would make retrieval slower than the map suggested, and that the third route junction had a drainage issue that would put them knee-deep in standing water and cost them at least 2 minutes. Calloway looked at the map again. Then he looked at the course. Then he looked at Nora with an expression she recognized from every room she had ever been in, the expression of someone deciding whether to listen or whether to protect the plan they already had. He protected the plan. They lost 4 minutes at the second station and 2.5 at the junction. They completed the objective but came in 40 seconds over the target time. Briggs marked it on his clipboard without visible expression. Calloway said the drainage issue was not predictable, which was partially true. Nora said nothing. Dean Hartley, who had watched the whole thing with the specific alertness of an engineer watching a structural problem unfold exactly as predicted, looked at Nora after they got back to the starting point, and asked her how she had seen the drainage issue from the staging area. She told him she had looked at where the water was running before she looked at the map. He was quiet for a moment, then he said that was a good method. That was the beginning of something. Not a friendship exactly, something more useful than that. Dean Hartley was a precise person. He did not say things he did not mean, and he did not attribute credit where it did not belong. Over the following days of team exercises, when the leadership rotated and Nora took her turns directing the group, he followed her calls with a completeness that Calloway had not managed. Not because Dean was told to, because he had run the first exercise and watched what happened when her read of the terrain was overruled, and he had stored that data. People who worked from data, Nora had found, were the most useful people in any group. Simon Cross was the same way. He was quiet in a manner that could read as passive until you watched him long enough to see that the quietness was processing. He absorbed information at a speed that surprised people who had written him off based on his size, which was unremarkable, and his manner, which was mild. In the team exercises, he consistently identified the most efficient solution about 30 seconds before anyone else, and then he waited to see if someone would say it before he did. When no one did, he said it. When someone else did, particularly when Nora said it, he confirmed it without ownership, which was rarer than it should have been. The two of them did not discuss this. They did not need to. By midway through week 2, the team dynamics had rearranged themselves in small but concrete ways. It happened the way most real rearrangements happen, not through a confrontation or an announcement, but through accumulated evidence that the room could not keep ignoring. Nora's team started hitting their time targets. The other teams did not, consistently. The instructors tracked it. They did not say anything about it yet, but they tracked it. Briggs called a general review at the end of the second week. The cohort gathered in the briefing room, which smelled of the same industrial cleaner as everything else, and had chairs arranged in rows that were slightly too close together. Briggs stood at the front with his clipboard and went through a composite performance review, team by team. He was fair in the clinical sense. He reported what the numbers said. He reported that Nora's team had completed 6 of 8 objectives within target time, which was the highest rate in the cohort. He did not say her name when he reported it. He referred to the team by number. She sat in the 3rd row and listened to the number and looked at the back of Pete Calloway's head in front of her and noted the very small tightening of his neck muscles. She had not been competing with Calloway. He had been competing with her, which was different. Competition with someone you have already dismissed requires the revision of a prior conclusion, and that revision was uncomfortable enough to live in his neck. She almost felt sorry for him. After the review, while the recruits filtered out toward the evening meal, Briggs stopped her at the door. Not physically, he stepped to the side, and she stopped because he had stopped, and they stood for a moment in the thin space of the doorway while the others moved past. He told her that her composite score was improving. She said yes. He said that the physical benchmarks were still his concern, and that she should be aware the final assessment weighted them heavily. She said she was aware. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen many times in many rooms, the expression of a person who has told themselves they are being helpful and has not examined the wiring behind that belief. He told her there was no shame in acknowledging limits. She held his gaze for exactly long enough. Then she said she would keep that in mind. She walked to the cafeteria and ate, and said nothing about the conversation to anyone. But that night in her bunk in the dark after lights out, she felt the words sit in her chest the way wrong things do. Not devastating, not even very surprising, just present. Sitting there with all the other things that had been said to her in doorways and offices and hallways by men who were certain they were helping. There was no shame in acknowledging limits. She had heard it from a school athletics coach when she was 15 and had wanted to run the longer distance. She had heard it from a first employer when she had applied for a role his team considered too demanding. She had heard it from the recruiter who had processed her first application to a federal program 3 years ago and had told her, with genuine kindness in his voice, that she might be better served by a different track. She was on her third application for this program. The first two had not reached the interview stage. She had spent the years between them closing every gap she could identify, and then applied again. The third application had moved forward. She was here. She pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes and ran through the next day's schedule in her head the way she always did before sleep, not anxiously, but precisely. The way her mother made plans, small and specific and forward-facing. Week 3 was next. She needed to sleep. She slept. What she did not know yet, what she would not know until later, until after everything had shifted and the room had rearranged itself completely, was that Briggs had written something in his assessment binder that evening after their doorway conversation. She would never see it. She did not need to, but it existed. And what it said was not what she expected him to say. What it said was that she had the best situational awareness of any recruit he had assessed in 4 years of running this program. He had written it, and then he had closed the binder and walked to his vehicle and driven home, and he had not changed the weighting on the physical benchmarks, and he had not said her name when he reported the team scores, and he had told her there was no shame in acknowledging limits. People contain contradictions. She knew that. She had always known that. It did not make the doorway easier. It just made it more accurate. The third week opened on a Tuesday with a change in schedule. The standard morning drill was replaced by a session Briggs called the Stress Evaluation Protocol, which was the program's way of saying that whatever they had planned, it was going to be harder than what the name suggested. The cohort lined up in the rain, which had not let up since Monday, and Briggs stood at the front of the line and told them they were going to spend the morning doing something that would feel simple and would not be. What followed was a 6-hour rotating drill designed specifically to test decision quality after physical exhaustion. The recruits cycled through a series of physical stations, carrying loads, obstacle navigation, controlled resistance exercises with instructors. And at each station, before moving on, they had to complete a cognitive task. A problem to solve, a pattern to identify, a sequence of instructions to memorize and report back accurately. The theory behind the protocol was straightforward. A person's thinking under normal conditions is one thing. A person's thinking after their body has spent 3 hours at maximum effort is something different. The program wanted people who could do both simultaneously. Nora had prepared for exactly this. She had read everything available about performance under physical stress. She had trained in conditions that deliberately combined physical load with cognitive demand. She had run drills while working through problems, had practiced memorization sequences after interval training, had conditioned herself to the particular unpleasant place where the body wants to stop and the mind has to keep going anyway. She did not do it perfectly. Nobody did. By hour 4, she was making small errors, transposing numbers in a sequence, missing a secondary detail in a visual pattern. But she recovered. She self-corrected. She flagged the errors to the evaluating instructor before they were pointed out to her, which was a behavior the evaluation was specifically designed to test, and which roughly a third of the cohort never managed at all. Owen Drake, who was comfortably the fastest recruit physically, hit a wall around hour 5. Not a physical wall, his body was fine. He sat down at a cognitive station with his hands on his knees and his chest working, and looked at the problem in front of him with the expression of someone whose mind and body had agreed to go in different directions. He completed it eventually, but the gap between his problem-solving quality in the first hour and his quality in the 6th hour was one of the largest in the cohort. Nora's gap was the smallest. This was not announced. The instructors wrote their numbers down and moved on. But in the debrief that afternoon, conducted in the same two small chairs in the briefing room, a second instructor named Harris, who was quieter than Briggs and watched things more than he spoke about them, looked at the printed results in his hands for a long moment, and then looked up at the cohort with an expression that was not quite readable. He said that the stress evaluation protocol was not a test of strength. He said it was a test of what remained when strength was no longer available. He did not look at Nora when he said it, but Gary Ashton, sitting 2 seats to her left, looked at her, and Pete Calloway, sitting in the front row, did not look at her, which was a different kind of looking. She walked back to the bunk hall that evening, and her knee hurt. It had been hurting since the obstacle navigation segment in hour 3, a low, persistent ache on the interior side that she recognized as a strain and had quietly categorized as manageable. She had not favored it during the drill because favoring it would have changed her movement pattern, and changed her movement pattern would have been visible, and visible meant noted, and noted at this point in the program meant exactly the kind of scrutiny she did not want. She sat on her bunk and pressed her fingers against the joint carefully and evaluated. Manageable, definitely manageable. Worse in the morning, probably, but manageable. Gary Ashton knocked on the bunk frame that evening. They were in an open bay arrangement, no real doors, just the frame at the end of each row, and he stood there with his arms folded and asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. He said he had seen her knee. She said it was not a problem. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he had not asked about the knee. He had asked if she was all right. She looked at him. He was not, she had decided by now, a complicated person. He was the kind of person who asked things because he meant them, and who meant things because he had not yet learned to calculate whether meaning things was advantageous. She found that quality in her experience extremely rare and rather valuable. She told him she was tired. He said he was too. He said they were all tired, and that the next 5 weeks were going to be worse. She said she knew. He said good night and went back to his bunk, and she lay down and looked at the ceiling for a while and thought about the stress evaluation and the cognitive gap and the small number that represented hers, the smallest gap in the cohort, which nobody had said out loud but which existed in a binder somewhere, adding up, slowly and without ceremony, into something. She thought about the word scrappy. She thought about no shame in acknowledging limits. She thought about her performance board placement from week 114, and she ran the number in her head against where she thought it sat now. The physical categories had moved, not dramatically, but the technical and cognitive columns, she was almost certain, had moved considerably. She thought, let the room keep looking at the physical columns. Let them look. She was building something in the other ones, something patient and structural and quietly enormous, and she was going to keep building it, 1 week at a time, until the room ran out of columns to ignore. The rain was still falling outside. She listened to it. She slept. The knee made itself known at mile 7. Not loudly. It was not the kind of pain that announces itself with drama. It was a specific, interior complaint, a structural sound that she felt more than heard, somewhere deep in the joint, that communicated clearly and without exaggeration that something had shifted and that the next several miles were going to be a negotiation. The 12-mile march was the centerpiece of week 5. Briggs had told them about it on day 1, casually, the way you mention a thing you want to be in someone's head for the weeks before it arrives. Full kit, full pack, terrain variable, weather irrelevant. Then, at the end of it, an immediate transition into a simulated combat drill, close quarters, live resistance from instructors, timed performance. The purpose, as Nora had understood it from the program documentation, was not simply to test the march or the drill. It was to test the drill after the march, the gap, the quality of a person when they have already spent everything they have and are then asked to spend more. She was 7 miles in when the knee opened negotiations. She did not stop. Stopping was a category of decision that did not occur to her at that point as a real option. Not because she was reckless, she was, if anything, the opposite of reckless, a person who made very careful and very specific choices about which discomforts to accept and which ones required attention. She accepted this one. She accepted it because she had evaluated it clearly. The joint was strained, not structurally compromised. It would be worse tomorrow. It was survivable today. She adjusted fractionally, enough to redistribute the load without creating the kind of visible compensation that the trailing instructor would notice. She had read enough about movement mechanics to know how to make a small adjustment invisible if she made it slowly enough. She made it slowly. The remaining 5 miles passed the way difficult miles pass, one at a time, each one its own small argument between the body that wanted to stop and the part of her that had been arguing back since she was 9 years old and learning to rebuild engines on a cold garage floor. She finished the march in the last cluster of recruits. Not last individually, she crossed the finish point at number 18 out of 23, which was not her best position of the program and which she had already calculated was acceptable given the circumstances. She had not come to the 12-mile march to win it. She had come to survive it well enough to be functional for what came after. What came after was the drill. The setup was a standard simulation room, a large interior space divided by movable barriers into sections that approximated a confined tactical environment. 2 recruits played the resistance role. The objective was for the assigned recruit to navigate from one end of the space to the other, managing the 2-person resistance within a set time. Briggs assigned her opposite 2 recruits. Their names were Glenn Morris, who had spent 2 years in a collegiate wrestling program before a shoulder issue ended it, and Carl Webb, who was the second largest man in the cohort and who had, in every team physical exercise, been the person Briggs called on when the task required someone substantial. The assignments were not random. She understood that. Briggs was watching something. Whether he was watching because he expected her to fail or because he was genuinely curious was a question she had stopped trying to answer about him weeks ago. The distinction did not change what she needed to do. She took 30 seconds at the starting position to look at the room, not the barriers, the angles, the sight lines, the weight distribution of the space, where the confined sections would favor bulk and where they would not. She had been doing this kind of spatial reading her entire adult life, had formalized it during her training preparation, had spent hours in various types of rooms teaching herself to read them in the first seconds of arrival. This room had 3 sections where the confined geometry worked against weight and in favor of leverage. She committed them to memory, and then the signal came. The first 90 seconds were straightforward. Glenn Morris came in from the left, which was the predictable entry. She had already decided not to take the impact directly. She was 61 kilograms against his 90-plus, and direct impact was a calculation she was going to lose. She used the first confined section and the angle she had identified from the starting line, and Morris covered a lot of distance and made contact with a barrier rather than with her. Carl Webb took longer to get into the room. His size made him slower in the confined geometry which she had calculated. By the time he positioned himself, she had already moved through the first section and was in the second, where the sight lines changed and the leverage geometry changed with them. The drill lasted 11 minutes. At the end of it, both Morris and Webb had tapped out of the simulation. She was at the objective point. The room was quiet for a moment. Not a long moment. Briggs marked something on his clipboard. Harris, who was observing from the side wall, made a notation. The 2 recruits who had played resistance got up from their respective positions, and one of them, Morris, looked at her with an expression that was not quite readable, but was not the expression she had expected. Nobody announced anything, but everyone in the room had seen it. And here was the thing about being seen, It was different from being noticed. She had been noticed from day one. Her presence had been noticed, her size had been noticed, her placement on the performance board had been noticed, and all of that noticing had led to a collective conclusion that the room had been quietly running with for 5 weeks. Being seen was different. Being seen meant the conclusion was being revised. And revision, once it started, was difficult to stop. She said nothing. She retrieved her kit and walked to the water station and drank and waited for the next assignment. Gary Ashton was behind her at the water station. He said nothing either, but he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, 1 second, maybe 2, and then took his hand away and filled his water container and walked back to the main floor. It was not a speech. It was not a celebration. It was exactly the size of thing it needed to be and no larger. Pete Calloway was on the other side of the room. She noted, from peripheral vision, that he was looking at the objective point rather than at her. He was a competitive person in the particular way that makes competition painful. He needed the comparison to confirm something about himself, and the comparison had just said something he had not planned for. She felt briefly something that might have been sympathy. She let it pass. She had too much to do to carry other people's revisions for them. The debrief that afternoon was shorter than usual. Briggs walked through the drill results in the same clipped numeric language he always used. He reported completion rates. He reported time averages. When he got to her result, objective point reached, both resistance players out of simulation, 11 minutes, he read the number and moved on. He said her name when he read it. Not the team number, her name, Nora Carver. She was sitting in the 3rd row. She kept her face neutral and her posture straight, and she looked at the back of the chair in front of her, and let the moment be exactly as small as it appeared and exactly as large as she knew it was. After the debrief, as the cohort moved toward the evening meal, Harris fell into step beside her for approximately 30 seconds. He did not look at her directly. He looked forward down the hallway at nothing in particular. He said, quietly, that the stress evaluation results from week 3 had been reviewed by the program advisory board. She said she was aware that the results were reviewed. He said that her composite cognitive performance under physical load was, and he paused as though choosing his word carefully, notable. She said thank you. He nodded once and peeled off toward the instructor's area, and she continued to the cafeteria and sat down with her tray and ate her food without mentioning the conversation to anyone. Simon Cross sat across from her. He was reading something on a folded printed sheet while he ate, which was a habit she had observed in him from the beginning, and which she found quietly companionable. He read and she ate, and neither of them said anything for several minutes. Then Simon looked up from his sheet and said, without any particular emphasis, that the drill result was going to change how the second half of the program ran. She asked him what he meant. He said that the room had a story it was telling itself, and the drill had introduced a fact that did not fit the story, and that when enough facts accumulated that did not fit a story, the story eventually had to change. She looked at him for a moment. He went back to his sheet. She thought about what he had said for the rest of that evening, not anxiously, the way she thought about most things, with a kind of precise, unhurried attention that people who knew her had learned not to interpret as indifference. It was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. It was what very careful attention looked like when it was not performing itself. She thought about the story the room had been telling. She thought about the facts she had been accumulating, week by week, drill by drill, column by column, and she thought about what happened when stories ran out of room to ignore facts. She thought, it is starting to run out of room. She was right. She just did not know yet how completely. The knee ached through dinner. She pressed her fingers against it under the table quietly and evaluated it the same way she had that morning. It had moved slightly from manageable toward requiring attention, which meant she was going to have to spend time on it tonight and adjust her approach for the next few days without adjusting it visibly. She knew how to do that. She had known how to do uncomfortable things quietly for most of her life. It was not a skill she had chosen to develop. It was one the world had developed for her, and she had decided, at some point along the way, that she might as well be excellent at it. She ate her dinner. She went back to her bunk. She worked on the knee for 40 minutes with the specific, practical attention she brought to everything, and then she laid out her kit for the next morning and turned off her light. 6 recruits were sleeping in the bunk hall around her. She could hear their breathing in the dark, the particular rhythm of people who had spent everything they had today and were recharging for tomorrow. She matched her breathing to the rhythm of the room without thinking about it. She was very tired. She was not done. Those two things had been true simultaneously for a very long time, and she had learned that they were not contradictions. They were just the conditions under which she operated. Tired and not done. Exhausted and not finished. Running on reserves she had been building since she was 9 years old on a cold garage floor with grease on her hands and an engine that had not yet decided to cooperate. The engine had cooperated eventually. Rooms always ran out of room eventually. She slept. The announcement came at 500. Not a whisper. Not a quiet note on the board. Briggs read it aloud in the low light of the pre-dawn briefing room while 23 recruits sat in rows with their coffee going cold and the week's full cohort exercise starting in 90 minutes. The squad leader for the exercise, he said, had been selected based on composite performance scores across weeks 1 through 6. He said her name. Nora Carver. The room did not cheer. It did what rooms do when a fact is introduced that revises a story they have been living inside. It absorbed. She heard the silence in layers. She heard the surprise in it which was expected. She heard the recalculation in it which was expected. She heard, beneath both of those, something else, something she had not anticipated, or perhaps had not let herself anticipate, because anticipating it would have made the waiting harder. She heard the beginning of acceptance. Not full acceptance. Not yet. That would take longer and some of them would never quite arrive there, but the beginning of it. The first moment, the room started to revise. She kept her face still and her posture straight. She looked at Briggs and she said, clearly and without volume she did not need, that she understood. Briggs held her gaze for a moment, then he went back to his clipboard. The exercise began at 6:30. The format was a full cohort scenario, shifting objectives, simulated opposition from a separate external team, rotating pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The squad leader's role was not to be the best physical performer in the field. It was to read the situation in real time, position 23 people correctly, adapt when the situation changed, which it would. The program always changed the situation, and make decisions quickly enough that the decisions still meant something by the time the team executed them. Nora had been thinking about this exercise since week 3. Not planning it exactly, thinking about it, running the parameters through her head in the quiet hours, the way she had always run things, quietly, specifically, without needing to announce the process. She had thought about how she would use Simon Cross, whose pattern recognition in team scenarios was the sharpest in the cohort. She had thought about how she would use Gary Ashton, who was not the fastest or the most technically skilled recruit, but who was, in her observation, the most reliably present person in any situation, the person whose attention never drifted, who executed what he was asked to execute completely rather than approximately. She had thought about Owen Drake and his speed, and where speed was the asset, and where it was the liability. She had thought about Dean Hartley's engineering precision, and where that quality could be positioned to the team's greatest advantage. She had thought about Pete Calloway. Calloway was competitive and physically capable, and had, in the second half of the program, quietly become a better teammate than he had been in the first half. The revision he had been forced to make after the drill had done something to him that she would not have predicted. It had made him more accurate. When the story he had been telling himself changed, the new version he built was more honest than the old one. He did not like her exactly, but he trusted her reads now, with the specific trust that comes from watching someone be right enough times that choosing not to trust them becomes the irrational option. She used him at the forward position in the first phase, where his physicality was the correct asset, and where being at the front would satisfy the competitive need in him in a way that made him productive rather than disruptive. The exercise ran for 4 hours. In the first phase, the objectives were straightforward, and Nora ran the team on clean lines, direct, efficient, using the people she had positioned for exactly the tasks that arrived. The external opposition team had been briefed to pressure the flanks in the first 30 minutes, which she had anticipated from the exercise structure. She had placed Dean Hartley and 2 other recruits with strong technical reads at the flank positions before the pressure arrived. The opposition found nothing easy on the flanks. In the second phase, at the 90-minute mark, the exercise controllers introduced a variable. 2 of Nora's 23 recruits were removed from active status, simulating incapacitation. The exercise was designed this way. Every session did it. The question was not whether the variable would arrive, but how the leader responded when it did. She redistributed in 45 seconds. Not because she had planned for those specific 2 recruits she could not have, but because she had built the positioning with redundancy in mind. Every role had a secondary person aware of it. Every objective station had 2 people who understood its function. The redistribution did not require explanation because the preparation had already done the explaining. Gary Ashton absorbed one of the removed roles without being asked. He had simply been paying attention, the way he always paid attention, completely, without performance, and he moved to where he needed to be and he executed. By hour 2, something had changed in the way the team was moving. It was not loud. It was not announced. It was the specific quality that emerges when 21 people stop calculating whether to follow a call and start simply following it, because the calls have been right enough times that the calculation has become unnecessary overhead. Simon Cross, working from a position where he could observe the full team formation, said nothing out loud. But at one point during the second phase, when Nora adjusted the team's angle of approach, based on a shift in the opposition's position that she had caught 30 seconds before anyone else in the field, Simon Cross turned briefly in her direction and nodded once. She had moved on before he finished the nod. At hour 3, Colin Briggs, who was observing from a raised position on the side of the field, said something. 2 words. He said them quietly, and he did not make a production of it, and he said them to the instructor standing next to him rather than into the open air. But the instructor next to him heard them. And later in the debrief, that instructor told Harris, who told no one and wrote it in his own notes in his own private shorthand. What Briggs said was, "Good call." He said it after Nora made a decision in the third phase that ran counter to what the exercise structure seemed to demand. A retreat rather than an advance, pulling 2 units back from what appeared to be the forward objective and repositioning them at an angle that made no sense until, 4 minutes later, the opposition moved exactly where she had anticipated, and the repositioned units were already there. The team met 4 out of 4 objectives. The opposition, which included 11 recruits from an external program who had completed their own field training and who had been specifically briefed on the scenario, met none. The exercise ended at 10:30. The teams assembled at the staging area. The opposition team's lead, a senior recruit named Howard Lang who had run field exercises for 2 years and who was, Nora had been told in passing, not someone accustomed to clean shutouts, walked across the staging area and stood in front of Nora and looked at her with an expression she had not encountered in many weeks. He looked at her with uncomplicated respect. He said that the repositioning in Phase 3 was something he had not seen coming. She said she had thought it was the correct read. He said it was. He said it was a very correct read. He shook her hand and walked back to his team. Briggs ran the debrief at 1100. He was his usual self, clipped, numeric, undemonstrative. He went through the exercise results with his clipboard in hand, and his voice doing what it always did, which was say exactly what the numbers said and very little else. He reported the team's completion rate. He reported the opposition's completion rate. He reported the time on each objective. He said her name when he reported the Phase 3 decision. Not the team number, her name. He said that the positioning decision at minute 167 was, and he checked his clipboard, tactically sound. Tactically sound. 2 words from a man who used words the way other people used expensive equipment, carefully, sparingly, with an awareness of their weight. She sat in the 3rd row. She felt the 2 words land somewhere internal. She did not allow herself to feel them fully, not yet, not in the room. She tucked them away with the stone she had been collecting since day 1. The scrappy stone. The no shame in acknowledging limits stone. The 14 on the board stone. And now this one, small and precise and worth more than the ones before it, though she did not let herself spend it yet. She was not done spending what she had. There was 1 week left. After the debrief, the cohort moved to the evening meal, and the cafeteria was louder than it had been on any previous evening. Not celebrating, the program did not encourage celebration mid-session, but something close to the sound a room makes when it has released a held breath. Recruits who had not spoken directly to Nora since week 1 were sitting within the same conversational orbit, not addressing her specifically in most cases, just near her, in the way that people rearrange themselves around a fact they have absorbed. Gary Ashton sat across from her and said that the Phase 3 read was the best call he had seen made in any team exercise he had participated in. She said she had a good team to work with. He looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with him, straightforward, present, not particularly interested in the complexity of things that were not actually complex. He said she was also good. She said she knew. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere that has not been coached. She found herself smiling at her tray. Pete Calloway sat at the end of the table. He did not say anything during the meal. He ate and he was quiet, and she did not look at him directly, and he did not look at her directly, and there was nothing hostile in any of it. There was just a kind of settling, a person setting down a version of himself that had become too heavy to carry. After the meal, walking back to the bunk hall, Simon Cross fell into step beside her. They walked for a while without speaking, which was the normal mode of walking with Simon Cross. Then he said, still looking forward, "The story changed today." She said, "It started changing at the drill." He considered this. Then he said that was probably accurate. She said she thought so. They reached the bunk hall and she went to her bunk and sat on the edge of it and looked at her hands. They were rougher than they had been on day 1. The palms had long since stopped complaining. The skin had just decided, at some point in the first 10 days, to adapt. She pressed her fingers against her knee, still aching, managing, cooperating in the specific way of things that have decided to get on with it. She laid out her kit for the next morning. She turned off her light. The final week was 7 days away. She had been waiting for it since she had packed her bag and dropped it at the entrance of this facility, and looked around at a room that was already looking back at her. She had been waiting with the particular patience of someone who knows exactly what they are waiting for, and has no intention of arriving empty-handed. She was not empty-handed. She lay in the dark with the sounds of the bunk hall around her. 22 people, various sizes, various expressions, all of them breathing in the dark with the same tiredness and the same forward-facing attention of people who had been through enough to know the only direction that mattered was forward. She matched her breathing to theirs. She slept. Rain on the last Tuesday. Not a coincidence. Not a sign. Just rain, the way rain had appeared repeatedly throughout 8 weeks at a facility that sat in a valley that caught weather coming off the hills and held it. Nora was awake before the alarm, which was, by this point, the unremarkable habit of someone who had stopped needing the alarm weeks ago. She looked at the ceiling for 60 seconds, and then she got up and made her bunk, and laid out the last day's kit with the same care she had used on day 1. The final week had been its own kind of weather. The program's last 7 days were not structured the same way the previous 7 weeks had been. The drills changed character. Less isolation, more integration. Less individual performance, more cohort-wide synthesis. Exercises that required all 23 recruits to function as a single unit, each person drawing on whatever they were strongest at, the composite performance of the group becoming the measured result rather than any single recruit's number. It was, in Nora's assessment, the most intelligently designed part of the program. It was also the part she had been looking forward to since she read about it in the program documentation 11 months before she arrived. She had spent 7 weeks building credit in the columns that people had not been watching. The final week was where those columns paid. The fitness evaluation was on Tuesday. The full cohort assessment was Wednesday through Friday. She had thought about the fitness evaluation. She had thought about it with the specific realism she brought to difficult things, not dismissing the difficulty, not catastrophizing it, just looking at it clearly and identifying what was true. What was true was that the physical benchmarks were weighted heavily in the final composite score. What was true was that her knee, now 8 days past the march, was cooperating without enthusiasm. What was true was that her physical scores had improved across the 7 weeks in real terms, that the gap between her benchmarks and the program standard had closed, and that the evaluation required sufficient rather than superior. She knew the sufficient line. She had been running her numbers against it for 6 weeks. She cleared it. Not first. The rain-soaked course was a leveler in its way. Nobody was running at their best on ground that had absorbed 3 days of continuous rainfall and was giving it back in complicated ways underfoot. Owen Drake, whose speed was his signature, finished first by a margin that was smaller than anyone had seen from him, because speed on uncertain footing had a different denominator than speed on solid ground. Nora finished the course at a position that would not make anyone's highlight reel, and that crossed the sufficient line by a margin that was not dramatic and was real. She stepped off the final element and stood in the rain and breathed. The knee registered the activity. She registered the knee. They had an agreement by this point. She would not ignore it. It would not escalate beyond what she could manage. It was an arrangement born of necessity and maintained through the specific stubbornness of 2 things that had decided not to negotiate on fundamental terms. She walked to the evaluation station and reported her time. Harris, marking the board, wrote it down and looked at it for a moment. He said nothing, but he circled something on the sheet, and she noticed the circle, and she chose not to ask what it was. She was fairly certain she knew. Wednesday. The full cohort assessment had a different energy from everything that had preceded it. The 23 recruits assembled at 600 in the main staging area, and there was a particular quality to the silence in the group, not the silence of uncertainty or fatigue, though both were present. It was the silence of people who are aware that they are in the final chapter of something and are paying a different kind of attention as a result. The exercise format was announced by Briggs at the staging area. A simulated opposition exercise, scaled up, 15 recruits as opposition to a squad of 8. The 8 would be selected by cohort vote, a program tradition Nora had read about and considered carefully. The cohort elected the squad by written ballot. The squad then elected their own point. The vote happened quietly, on small slips of paper, in the first minutes of the 600 briefing. Ballots were collected and counted by Harris, who was efficient about it in the way he was efficient about most things. He read the 8 names. Her name was one of them. She had not assumed it would be. She had thought it was possible. She had run the probabilities the way she ran most things, quietly and with an honest assessment of the inputs, but she had not assumed it. Assumption required a certainty she had trained herself out of through years of being in rooms that revised her downward without warning. She did not assume. She calculated, and the calculation had said possible, not certain. Possible had been sufficient. The squad of 8 convened briefly at the side of the staging area, away from the opposition group. There were no instructions for how the points should be selected. That was also part of the exercise. The 8 recruits stood in a loose arrangement in the rain and looked at each other. Gary Ashton said her name. That was all he said. Nobody disagreed. She took the point without ceremony. She studied the field for 90 seconds, listening to the scenario briefing from Briggs with the specific quality of attention she had been practicing since the program began. The kind that filed not just the stated facts but the unstated ones, the gaps, the places where the exercise designers had left room for variables. Then she positioned her squad. The opposition of 15 included the strongest physical performers in the cohort. It included Pete Calloway, who was, she had to admit, genuinely formidable in the kind of exercise that rewarded physical performance. It included Owen Drake, whose speed in the field was a real asset regardless of the weather. It included 3 recruits from the external program who had participated in the Week 7 exercise and who were, this time, properly calibrated for what she might do. She changed her approach accordingly. The exercise lasted 40 minutes. She would not remember it clearly in the linear way. What she would remember was more like a series of specific moments, each one its own complete picture. The sight line she identified at minute 12 that the opposition had not covered. The adjustment she made at minute 20 when the external recruits compensated for her initial angle, the way she had known they might, and the prepositioned response she had already staged. Gary Ashton's absolute reliability at the position where reliability was the only thing that mattered. Simon Cross reading the opposition's pattern shift before she called it and having already moved. The 15-person opposition was coordinated and skilled, and in the end, had not had enough room to work with. The squad of 8 met every objective. When the exercise ended, Briggs walked out onto the field and stood at the center of it, and looked at the results on his clipboard for a moment that was longer than his usual efficiency required. Then he looked up at the assembled 23 recruits, 8 on one side, 15 on the other, all of them wet and exhausted and present in the way that 8 weeks of difficulty makes people present. He said the exercise results were, and he paused in the specific way that Nora had spent 8 weeks learning to hear, exceptional. He said the squad had achieved 100% of its objectives against an opposition that had been, he noted without elaboration, very well prepared. He said the exercise had demonstrated cohort-level performance that met every marker the program required. Then he said Carver, front and center. She walked forward from the squad. The rain was still falling. Her knee was informing her of its continued existence. She stood in front of Briggs on a field that had been the site of her worst days and her best work, and approximately 8 weeks of quiet, patient, methodical proof. He looked at her, she looked at him. He said that her composite score across the full program ranked 3rd in the cohort. She said nothing. He said that her cognitive performance under physical load had been flagged by the program advisory board as the strongest in the cohort's recorded history. She said nothing. He said, and here his voice changed in a way that was very small and that she suspected nobody else in the assembled group noticed, that he had written in his assessment, at the end of week 2, that she had the best situational awareness of any recruit he had assessed in 4 years of running this program. She had not known that. She looked at him, and for a moment she felt the weight of every stone she had been carrying, every pause, every scrappy, every no shame in acknowledging limits, every name unspoken when it should have been spoken. She felt them. Then she let them go. Not with drama, not with a speech. She just released the weight of them quietly, the way you set down a bag you have been carrying for a very long time, and she felt the specific lightness of someone who has arrived at the place they were heading toward and no longer needs to carry what they needed for the journey. She said, "Thank you, sir." He nodded once. She walked back to her squad. Gary Ashton said nothing. He stood beside her in the rain with his arms at his sides, and his face doing the thing his face did, which was simply be present without needing it to be anything else. Simon Cross was on her other side, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone whose internal calculation had just confirmed a result they already knew. Pete Calloway was standing with the opposition group across the field. He was looking at her, not with the expression she had learned to recognize and file in week 1, not the certainty, not the conclusion already drawn. He was looking at her with something she had not expected to see from him. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who has revised their understanding of a thing and found, to their own surprise, that the revised version is better than the original. He gave her a single nod across the field. She gave him one back. That was the end of it. The 23 recruits dispersed toward the staging area, toward the debrief that would follow, toward the final administrative stages of a program that had run for 8 weeks and had tested all of them and had found, in the end, what it needed to find. She stood in the rain for a moment after the others had moved. She was not celebrating. Triumph was too loud for what this was. What this was something quieter and more permanent than triumph. It was the feeling of a room that has run out of columns to ignore. It was the feeling of a story that has been revised by enough facts that it can no longer hold its original shape. It was proof. And proof did not need a ceremony. Proof just needed time and persistence, and someone willing to keep building in the columns nobody was watching, until the columns nobody was watching became impossible to ignore. She had known that since week 1. She had known it since long before week 1. Since a cold garage floor in western Pennsylvania, and an engine that had not yet decided to cooperate, and the specific patience of being very young and understanding already that the things worth doing require the willingness to be underestimated for as long as the underestimation holds. The engine had cooperated. The room had caught up. She looked at her hands. The palms were very different now from what they had been on day 1. They had adapted. They had stopped negotiating with the difficulty and had simply incorporated it, the way things do when they decide to stop fighting the conditions and start using them. She was wet and her knee was aching, and she was standing in a field at the end of 8 weeks that had asked her for more than she had ever been asked to give in a concentrated period. She had given it. She picked up her kit and walked off the field. The rain was still falling. She had earned the right to walk in it.